Hello, I'm Dick Fleming, a former English language conference interpreter with the Commission in Brussels, and now retired, as you can probably see. I've been asked to talk briefly about simultaneous interpreting, which is what I spent most of my working time doing, in fact, in Brussels. As I'm sure you know, simultaneous interpreting is interpreting delivered at the same time as the speaker by interpreters sitting in interpreting booths, wearing headphones, and delivering their interpretation into a microphone, as opposed to consecutive interpretation, which is delivered after the speaker has finished speaking by an interpreter who's usually taken notes on what the speaker has said. And consecutive interpretation is, in fact, the older of the two modes, used for, I would say, hundreds of years, before the breakthrough for simultaneous came at the end of the Second World War, when it was used at the Nuremberg Nazi trials. And it was probably used because they didn't want to spend time interpreting into what was then 4 languages, English, French, German and Russian, when everyone wanted to get on with the business of trying these Nazi criminals. The time factor is, in fact, the most important reason, I think, why simultaneous is used rather than consecutive. In an international meeting, you can provide simultaneous interpretation into 20 different languages in the time it takes for the speaker to deliver his speech. Now imagine how long it would take if you tried to deliver 20 different consecutive interpretations, one after the other. Now, consecutive interpretation is still used for bilateral meetings at a high level, and also for meetings outside Brussels, or outside headquarters at any rate, where there are only 2 languages being used, or where perhaps you're miles away from the nearest simultaneous interpretation facilities, such as in a restaurant by the sea in Mykonos. Fond memories, in fact. But the bulk of our work nowadays is done in simultaneous. And perhaps this is why students of interpreting often can't wait to start simultaneous. They see it as the real thing, as opposed to faffing about with a notepad and pencil. It also offers the relative anonymity of the booth, rather than the glare of full frontal consecutive. And lastly, sometimes they hope that it will put an end to all their problems they've had in consecutive, trying to remember things. It's also a fact that most of the professional interpreters I know prefer simultaneous to consecutive, and are probably better at it too. But I think that's because practice makes perfect, and they've had a lot more practice in simultaneous and consecutive since they finished their interpreting course. However, it doesn't mean that they were better at it or even preferred it when they were on that interpreting course. They may have found it initially quite difficult, and for good reason too. You see, whichever mode of interpreting you're performing, whether it's consecutive or simultaneous, the same basic mechanism applies. That of listening, understanding, analyzing, and reformulating. The difference being that in simultaneous you have to do it all at the same time, including the reformulation part. And doing everything at once ought to make it more difficult, and it does. Point 1. In simultaneous, you never quite know what's going to come next, since you don't have the overview of the whole speech before you start to interpret. And this can create all sorts of problems, like missing a negative. I've missed a few in my time, I have to admit. And this is something that wouldn't normally happen in consecutive, where you know the position of the speaker before you start interpreting. Another reason why you might miss something important in simultaneous is the fact that you are talking yourself while trying to listen to the speaker, and your voice can easily mask something vital in the original. And then, even if you do manage to hear and understand everything the speaker is saying, you don't have much time in simultaneous to come up with a clear and natural way of expressing these ideas in your own language, especially since the words and the syntax of the original will still be ringing in your ears when it comes to the process of reformulating. And this explains the presence all too often of clumsy, unnatural forms, unnatural turns of phrase, if you like, taken directly from the source language in many a beginner's simultaneous interpretation. But please, don't be put off. Simultaneous can be done, and can be done very well, as professional interpreters prove every day. You just have to realize that although you are applying the same basic interpreting mechanism to a different mode, you're also actually learning to do something rather unnatural, which is listening and talking at the same time and still making sense. So don't worry if it doesn't click straight away. You'll need all the practice you can get on the latter part of your course if you're a student, and you'll still need plenty of professional practice afterwards to reach a decent level of proficiency. So here are a few basic tips for beginners of simultaneous interpretation. Go for quality rather than quantity right from the outset. It's not a question of repeating as much as you can of the original speech. It's more a question of making sure that what you do say is expressed clearly and cogently. Also, try and make sure that you speak your language naturally. And this will be much easier if you latch on to the ideas rather than the words in the original speech. Thirdly, use short and simple sentences just to make life easier for yourself. And only attempt to interpret what you've understood. Otherwise, you'll end up inventing, which is worse than saying nothing at all. And finally, try to make sure that someone is listening to you when you practice, rather than just performing into the ether. And this, if you've got somebody listening to you, should encourage you to be clear and convincing because you have a customer. It will mean that you'll think more about your audience rather than yourself, which always helps. And it will mean that you get useful feedback later. So, follow these suggestions and keep listening. Keep listening to your teachers, to the speaker, and to yourself. And you'll soon be turning out the sort of simultaneous that delegates are perfectly happy to listen to all day. Thank you.